Greetings to you all. My name is Benjamin Ferencz, and I have been invited by the National Academy for Continuing Legal Education to share with you some of my observations about international law, international criminal law, or other things that I may have learned since the days when I was a prosecutor at Nuremberg. I believe I am now the sole surviving prosecutor. I am now in my 98th year, and I would like to take a few minutes to give you a brief reminder of my background, since some of you will already be familiar with it, and then try to share with you some of my conclusions regarding the current status of international criminal law, the current status of the acceptance of the rule of law throughout the world, and what it means to you, each individual. My beginnings were as humble could be. I was born in a little hut, really, a house in what was then Romania. A year and a half before, when my sister had been born in the same house in bed, it was Hungary. I learned something about what difference it made, whether you came from one country or another. In fact, it made no difference whatsoever in my family, although we had this diverse nationality. What was important was how the inhabitants in each country were treated. Hungary and Romania had one very clear thing in common. They persecuted all the Jews. My parents, newlyweds, had two young children and decided to flee poverty and persecution in Romania and go to the United States. Since my parents had no money, no language, no friends, except two little babies, my father was satisfied to be hired as a janitor of a house in Hell's Kitchen in New York. And that's where my memory begins. To jump ahead, in due course, I was admitted to the Harvard Law School. That's quite a jump from Hell's Kitchen in New York and poverty. I won a scholarship for my exam on criminal law. I didn't know any lawyers, but I knew some criminals. While I was still at law school, Japan attacked the United States at Pearl Harbor. Everybody I knew volunteered to get into military service, including me. Since I was very short, I had difficulty finding a branch that would take me. But I eventually became a private in the artillery, and in that capacity, a member of the 115th AAA Gun Battalion. We landed on the beaches of Normandy. I crossed the Rhine on a pontoon bridge. I went through the Maginot Line, the Siegfried Line. I was in the Battle of the Bulge, the final battle of the war. And when I was honorably discharged as a sergeant of infantry, I was awarded 5 battle stars for not having been killed in any of the 5 major battles of the war. My most interesting experience during my years as a combat soldier and thereafter was when I was called to the headquarters, sent to the headquarters of General George Patton. He had received notification that the United States government had decided upon having war crimes trials against the major war criminals. We were pretty well informed as to what was going on. While I was at law school, one of the jobs I had was to be a researcher for the leading American criminologists, since I was interested in crime prevention as a career. And that criminologist, Professor Sheldon Gluck, hired me to do the research for a book he wrote on war crimes. And we had got reports in of what was actually happening in Germany and their persecution of the Jews and others. So I had a fairly good idea, and I guess the Army approached him because he was in consultation with the Pentagon at that time, and asked for help or something, and he said, you go find this researcher of mine, Ben Ferencz, he's over there somewhere. So they tapped me on the shoulder, and I was ordered to go to Patton's headquarters. They told me that your name has been forwarded from Washington. We are ordered to set up a war crimes branch. What's a war crime? They had no idea where to begin. And I was then a corporal in the artillery. Well, our first assignments were what we call the Allied flyer cases. Allied flyers flying over territory which was occupied by Germany, or was Germany itself, or occupied France, mostly Germany itself, would be shot down largely by our own 115th AAA gun battalion. There's something wrong with the plane coming in. They didn't give the signal identification, friend or foe, IFF, which was supposed to send a signal out that this is a friendly plane. It didn't work, or the guns didn't work. The guns were automatically set by radar to fire on the target as soon as it came within range. And if it was one of our planes or a British plane and had not sent that signal not to fire, we would aim, and for the first time, bang, they would shoot the plane down. They told us not to worry about Normandy because they had this new secret weapon, which of course the Germans knew all about it, and the Germans defeated the weapon by coating pigeons with aluminum foil, and the guns would pick up the pigeons, and they'd be firing in all different directions against the pigeons while we were the cooked goose underneath, being strafed by German planes. So the first cases we had were these Allied flyer cases, because the report was that 2 or 3 Allied flyers had been shot down and captured by the mob and usually beaten to death. I must add, in fairness, not all of them. If you landed on a farm somewhere, the German males were all off in the army. The housewife or the farmer's wife who remained was often glad to have somebody to help her with the farm work, and she shielded the American or British flyers who were shot down. There was such cases as well. But the usual routine was they were surrounded by a mob and beaten to death. These were my first introduction to war crimes cases. I would race into the town. I had arranged with my colonel that I was to be given a free hand. I said, look, I know what's to be done. Get out of my way. I cannot do this job as a corporal or even as a sergeant. He promoted me to a sergeant when he was moved from lieutenant colonel to full colonel based upon his reports, which I wrote. I said, get out of my way. I will do the job. I painted on the front of my Jeep, Immer line, always alone, thinking of the Lone Ranger. I would race to the scene where the crime was reported to have occurred. I would find whatever official I could. It was a postmaster or a civil servant of some kind. We had already occupied the territory, and I would tell them to bring into a meeting place, usually a hall of some kind, everybody who was on the scene when that incident occurred. And he would do that, and I'd get a room with maybe 10, 15 people in it. And my standard routine, I mention it because it was contentious later, was to line them up. At that time, I didn't speak German. I learned to speak while I was there, but I'd have a translator, and this is, you tell them that they're going to write out exactly everything that happened, and anybody who lies will be shot. Now, in later years, when I described that, many of the human rights organizations, which I was a supporter of in many ways, would say, you didn't say that. You can't threaten to kill him. I said, what did you want me to tell him? To tell him that I'm going to be disappointed? That I'm going to cry? That you're not going to get any dessert tonight? What the hell do you think I was doing there? I'm just going to go be nice to them? But wasn't that illegal to threaten to kill him? And I knew my law, and I said, no, it was not illegal. It was reciprocity. At every station, there were big signs. If the Jews don't show up on the time declared when they had to be there to be transported, they would be killed. Todesstrafe, I mean, death penalty was for them. And even quite apart from that, the reality of war is such, you can't go in there and say, now look, I know that you beat up these 3 flyers and you killed them with sticks and stones and stabbed them with a crowbar. That's what the type of cases. So please be nice to me and tell me who did that and what you did during all that time. That's not war. War doesn't work that way. And I learned that very early on, as well as finding the bodies, digging them up wherever you found them. Sometimes they were thrown into a river. You had to go downstream to see where they might have been a cemetery somewhere, or they were just thrown into a ditch and covered over. So wintertime, the ground was hard. You had to dig them out. I couldn't do it on my own. I'd commandeer a few of the German farmers there and say, get some shovels and picks. Be very careful. There's something in there. Go gently around the outskirts, because if you hit them with a pick, I wouldn't know if it was a bayonet wound or a bullet wound or what. So we had to be very ginger about making sure that we first softened the ground all around before we could locate the body and then to bring it out. And I was there alone. By that time, we had, of course, occupied the town, and the troops were already scattered, nowhere in sight, to disinter the body. And I developed my own technique for that. It may sound very horrible, and it was very horrible. You find a location, locate the legs, find a foot, tie a rope around the foot, and tie it up to the back of my Jeep, and then slowly move the Jeep forward, hoping that you, by going slowly and stopping and pull and stopping and pull, it'll come out with more than just a leg or a foot. I did that. Then I would write up a report and send out arrest warrants for anybody who was connected with the crimes. There were a lot of interesting incidents there. Again, I will recite it because I want to give you a feeling of what it was really like, and I don't know if I've reported in this detail on any of the previous reports. I don't think I have. We had one case which was particularly striking. A mother came and she said, my daughter was hitting the flyer on the head with her shoe. And I told her, come away, this is not a thing for a German girl to do. And it's a shame, and I tried to pull her off, but she was kept on hitting him in the head with a shoe. In that particular case, the beatings on the head with the shoe, of course, wouldn't have killed him and didn't kill him. They called the fireman out, and he had a crowbar, and he split the flyers over the head with it, split his head. It was sprayed with blood, and said, that's what he likes, that's what I like. Good American blood. And I placed the girl under immediate arrest. I went out to try to catch the guy. I went to his house, kicked the door in. His wife came to the door. I said, is your husband here? No, he's not here. Where is he? I don't know. Move over. Go in, search the house for him. He wasn't there. I said, did you do his laundry? You do his laundry? Yes. You have his shirt? Yes. Give me the laundry. So I got the shirt. It had already been washed, but there was still enough blood in there so that I could identify the man who had that shirt on and the blood of the flyer who had been murdered. I held that as evidence. I had the girl, and I had her placed immediately under house arrest till I come back and interrogate her. And her mother was pleading for her. Said, look, she just had lost 2 babies in an air raid from the Allies. And so she was distraught. She didn't know what she was doing. Well, the truth is, I was sorry for her. And I said, all right, she remains under house arrest. She's not to leave here without my permission, and thus I let her go. And I went back to my headquarters either the same day or the next day, more likely, or maybe 2 days more likely, depending on what other evidence there was in connection with that particular matter. And wrote up the report as to identity of the flyers who were killed. There were all kinds of problems. Sometimes they were stripped naked. I didn't know who they were. If I was lucky, they still had their fatigue pants on, and on the inside of their pants we were required to put the last 4 letters, numbers of your serial number and your initial. I could look at that and find the identification on his trousers and report that back to headquarters for relay to the Adjutant General's office to notify the next of kin. And so these were the details with which I was occupied. The girl in question happened to be on trial, but just several months later, when I was on my way home, I was already under orders to leave. I heard the trial was on. Somebody said that you handled that case in Groß-Gerau, which was a town near Frankfurt. I said yes. I went in, and she was on trial, and they also had the fireman who cracked the head open, and there were a couple of others involved in the same case. And the trial was already in process when I came in, and suddenly the girl whom I recognized stood up and sort of fainted. And a doctor came, a military doctor. It was a military trial with 3 military officers. These trials were conducted in the Dachau concentration camp, a symbolic U.S. military tribunals not to be associated with the Nuremberg trials. And I asked the doctor, how is she? He said, she's all right, she's fine, she's just pregnant. I said, pregnant? Yes, from one of the American guards. So that was an interesting thing for me. I don't know whether it was consensual or not consensual. Since she was a prisoner and he was a guard, it could hardly have been consensual in the true sense. But it might have been. The girl was trying to be protected. There was a rumor going that we would never execute someone who was pregnant, and which is not, of course, true. Or at least there is no standard that I'm aware of which requires that. So it showed me again what happens in wartime. The things you would least expect, human nature in whatever form, either self-defense or whatever it was, these are the things that happen. And these were the first trials that we encountered, the Allied flyer cases. Then we began to run into the concentration camps. The first one was Buchenwald. There was a 4 camp. They all had satellite camps. The satellite was called Gusen, G-U-S-E-N, named after the town usually. I get to Gusen, I go into the camp, and by this time, I suppose, I hope, that anybody who's listening to this recording will be familiar with what it was like. If you're not familiar, I urge you to try to visit the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum or any of the other memorial museums, either in Israel or other parts of the world, and you will see what I witnessed when I came in to Buchenwald. I was there before General Patton got there, and I was there before General Eisenhower came to visit, got there. The typical scene, and they were all rather typical. The SS is fleeing, running out of the camp. The inmates, those that can, are still trying to catch them, running after them. The ground is covered with people you think are dead. They're not dead. They look like skeletons. And you get near them and only their eyes are pleading for help. The crematoria are still going. There are piles of human bones, human beings piled up in front of the crematoria, waiting to be burned. Stench of the crematoria going. Total chaos. Rats, cholera, I don't know what other diseases, epidemic, diarrhea all over the place. And my job was to get in, get the evidence, and get the hell out of there if you can, as fast as you can. And I had a standard routine. I believe this is the first time I'm going into such detail here because I assume some of you have done other tapes of my experiences. I don't want to repeat too much. But the standard routine was to head immediately first to the tank commander who was in charge. And I'd go to him and I would tell him, I'm here on orders of General Patton. I'm carrying out orders from the President of the United States. I must have preparation for war crimes trials, immediately 10 men to surround the Schreibstube, the office where all the records are kept. And I had no insignia on me. I refused to wear any insignia. I said to the colonel, I cannot do my job of coming in as a corporal or as a sergeant. So and I had written out a pass signed by order of the commanding officer, who was Patton, signed by a lieutenant who was reasonably sober at the time, and had him sign that. I had it in my pocket if I had to show it. I very seldom had to show it. Sometimes on the road there would be a roadblock and I had to show it, but I just walked in and acted like I was coming directly from Patton and from Eisenhower to tell them what to do. And they did. They were very obedient. I'd get 10 men, surround the camp. Nobody goes in, nobody goes out without my permission. I'd go in, find an inmate who spoke English and German, or we had some Dutch soldiers assigned to us to serve as our translators. But I didn't need them. I mean, I knew enough to make myself clear. And I would then collect the evidence there, which were the registries of everybody who was in the camp, when they arrived, when they died, what they died from, page after page. Typhus, typhus, typhus means typhus, 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 or auf der Flucht erschossen, shot while trying to escape, shot while trying to escape, page after page after page, all phony excuses. They were all murdered. But just they had to have some reason, and they'd have page after page of the same kind of, just put one or two things to select. I had the name of the commanding officer. And sometimes there was something very interesting, which I'm going to recount to you. One of the camps, one of the Schreiber, as it was called, the clerk, an inmate, said, "We've been waiting for you. Come with me." So he took me to the electrified fence, which surrounded all these camps. He had a shovel, and he dug up a box. It was about twice the size of a shoebox. And he took me back to the office, which is one of the huts, on the campground. And he opened it up, and in that there were little folders, sort of a brochure, a little tiny folder, something like this. And it was a club which existed in the camp. They had, in the evening when the SS went to this club, they had entertainment of various kinds, and they had to sign in, and they got a stamp put into this club book of attendance at these events. When the book was filled, a new book would be issued, and he was supposed to destroy the old book and issue the new one. Instead of destroying it, he filed it, he kept it, and the box was full of these old cards. In there, I had a picture of the officer, the date he was there, where he came from, his name, fantastic evidence of the guys who would say, "I was never there, I was just doing business." So, of course, this was priceless evidence for me, and of course I kept that. But it told me something else which was important, that even though it would have cost him his life had he been caught at any time trying to keep that, they would have killed him on the spot. No doubt in my mind whatsoever, because they were killing people for any whim. Even though he risked his life dozens of times, he did so believing that there would be a day of reckoning. And I was the reckoning. And that moved me, it touched me, because even in such desperate condition, the human heart, the human mind can reach out knowing, hoping that one day justice will be done. So I have mentioned these incidents in the camps. I've seen other incidents where some of the inmates caught one of the guards and beat him up pretty good, but didn't want to kill him. So they strapped him to one of the metal gurneys, which they used to shovel the people into the crematorium. And they tied him to it, and they put him into the crematorium for a while. They warmed him up and took him out and beat him up and then put him back again until he was finally cooked. I was standing there watching that, and I asked myself, "Now, Ben, can you stop that? How are you going to stop that?" Because it was repeated, it was the thing. It was all over in a minute, and I didn't feel like stopping it. I knew that what was happening was horrible, and when I had something similar in France, where the Frenchmen would, after they were liberated, some of the towns, they would take the girls who had been cohabiting with the German soldiers, and they would cut her hair off. They would just take one of these barber things and put her in the town square and spit on her and shave her head, so that half the girls in town were wearing scarves over their head. I came upon one or two such incidents, and I was able to break it up. I'd fire a couple of shots in the air, say this is under arrest. I'd seize her, put her in the Jeep, ride her, or take her home and get out of the car. And in the concentration camp, I couldn't have done that, because I think if I had tried to stop them, they would have killed me too. I had my gun with me. The troops were there. Each one was usually chasing the SS. I mention this because the normal, rational human mind can hardly grasp situations like that. But I'm telling you, that's the way it was, and more so. Animals, human beings turning to animals, seeing some of the inmates, the garbage was in a big pile, they piled up as to 8 or 10 feet high, and crawling into the garbage, with their fingers trying to find a morsel of food to prevent the starvation. So this was the reality of war as I saw it. When the war was over, I was very glad to go home. The Army had their procedures. It would have taken them many months to arrange the shipments, where we were being assembled outside of Paris in different camps and shipped off. It would have taken me months to get home. I was not inclined to wait months. I had joined the Army in order to do my bit. I had done my bit, and spades maybe. We had won the war. I'm going home. So I went home. Since I had been in supply and I had copies of the official stamps and all of the paraphernalia needed to forge any documents, which I was able to do in the interest of justice and of speed, I stowed away on a ship, and Bing Crosby had assured us in the decampment site off Paris that we'll be home for Christmas. I'm not going to make a liar out of Bing Crosby. I had written to my fiancée that if you don't hear from me for 10 days, don't worry, I'm on leave. If you don't hear from me for 10 days, don't worry, I'm in jail. And I did arrive home the day before Christmas, announced that I was back and alive and well. The next day I reported for being discharged. They said, they don't make discharges on Christmas. I said, I'm going home, goodbye. But they did give me a discharge certificate, an honorable discharge, the day after Christmas, and 5 battle stars for not having been killed or wounded during all of the major battles of the war. And so ended, I thought, my Army career. However, I came back with 10 million other GIs looking for a job. And I'd just gotten out of law school. I'd passed the bar, but I had no clients. I had no money, and I had no job. And one day I got a call from a cable that said, "Dear sir, would I please come to the Pentagon and want to talk to me?" Okay, I went to the Pentagon, and they wanted to rehire me. First, they'll give me a rank of a colonel if I'll rejoin the Army. I said I will not under any circumstances join the Army unless you declare war on Germany and I'll lose it. So they said, well, we'll let you go as a civilian. I said, how long do I have to sign up for? And they said, you can name it. You can quit anytime you like. Well, at that point, I said, okay, you got a deal. I called up my fiancée, who'd been waiting patiently for about 10 years while I went off to law school, went off for the war, etc. I said, how would you like to go to Europe for a brief honeymoon? She said, I'd love it. I said, you got it. We're going to get married, and I'm going to take the job. And I did. And so off I went. Now, this was something new. The International Military Tribunal trial, which Justice Jackson represented the United States, and the British and the French and the Russians had their own representatives. There was the trial against Goering and Company, which is world famous. That was already in process. But the United States had taken the lead in advocating that there be additional subsequent trials in order to really explain not just a snapshot of a few leaders, but how did it come about that a civilized country like Germany would allow these crimes to occur, and in fact were the perpetrators and planners of these horrendous crimes. And so the object was to set up a dozen more trials, one against the doctors who performed medical experiments on concentration camp victims, another one against the lawyers and the judges who betrayed their trust by persecutions and prosecutions and imprisonments for political purposes, against the generals, of course, who were committing aggressions against other countries, against the foreign ministers, and against the industrialists for putting up the money to build the concentration camps and working the people to death as part of their way of enriching themselves and aiding the German war effort. So we were going to have a dozen trials of that kind. And Justice Jackson was going back to his position on the Supreme Court of the United States, and President Truman appointed Telfer Taylor, who had been in the service as a colonel. He had been in public service in Washington before, to be in charge of all of these 12 subsequent trials. And when I responded to their cable to come to Washington, and they wanted me to go back to the Army, and I'd refused, Telfer Taylor found out that I was being interviewed, and he called me in. And he said, I understand that they want to get you to go back, and we have these subsequent trials. And he said, I've been checking up on your records. And he said, and I find that you're occasionally insubordinate. And I said, I'm sorry, sir, that's not correct. I'm usually insubordinate. I never obey an order which I know is illegal or stupid. And so there are many occasions in which that charge might be made. But if you don't issue illegal and stupid orders, you can't find a better man. And he smiled, and he said, you go with me. And not only did I go back as his assistant, later when those trials were over, we became law partners in New York. And we remained very close friends until he died many years later. Anyway, so I go back with Telfer Taylor for the subsequent proceedings. And I said, well, first thing we have to do is get the evidence. What suspects do we have in custody? Because if you have only a name and you don't have the body, you've got nothing. And if you have the body and you don't have evidence, you've got nothing. So we had to combine. I had the list of suspects in custody, some indication of what they were suspected of, and that was it. So I put together a team of about 50 people. I went to Berlin from Nuremberg, which is where most of the German files were kept, the various ministries, and assigned people to go through the former SS building and the Gestapo headquarters and different banks and different industries and foreign ministry and so on, and to find evidence which would relate to criminality on the part of the list of suspects that I had. And one day, one of my researchers came in. He said, look what I found. And he gave me 3 big, looked like looseleaf books. And I opened it, and it was, I'm translating from the German, top secret, events on the Eastern Front. Literally, specifically, it was events from the Union of Soviet Republics, from the Russian front, really. And Eastern Front would be a fair translation. And they were daily reports which were assembled in Berlin based upon reports from the field of 4 different companies who were members of Einsatzgruppen, they were called, and nobody could pronounce it. Nobody knew what it meant. And it was deliberately kept secret. They didn't want them to know, because the assignment of these special action groups would be a literal translation, Einsatzgruppen, special action groups, was to murder without pity or remorse every single Jewish man, woman, and child they can get a hold of. That was order number one. They never said murder, of course. Eliminate. Eliminate. Do the same with the gypsies. Do the same with anybody else who posed an immediate or potential threat against the German Reich. That was their order, 3,000 men, supported by the Army. The Army provided logistic support. They had their own vehicles, of course, but food, ammunition, things like that. So these guys gave their daily reports. I had added them up. I began with a little hand-adding machine. So many Jews in Smolensk, 33,421 on this and this date, down to 10,000 here, 5,000 there, etc. When I reached 1 million people killed, I took the sampling. I got on the next plane to Nuremberg. I went to see General Taylor. He had been promoted to general then. I said, General, we have to put on a new trial. I have here in my hand mass murder on an unprecedented scale. We can't let these guys go. He said, well, I can't do it anymore. He said, it's too late. The program has been approved in the Pentagon. The budget has been set. We don't have any staff. All the lawyers who were assigned have already been assigned on the other cases. We just can't do it. And I sort of blew my cool, gently, I guess, and said, we can't let these guys go. This is the biggest murder case I've ever seen. There's thousands of people murdered every day. And I know the names of the people in charge. And I got the names and the time and the place. And he said, well, can you do this in addition to your other duties? I said, sure. He said, okay, you're it. And so it came to pass, for those of you who are young lawyers starting out, that I was assigned to be the chief prosecutor in the Einsatzgruppen trial. Case number 9, Office of the U.S. Chief of Counsel for War Crimes. And based on that evidence, we had the defendants, all the defendants, who I had selected. I first sent out the list of all the Einsatzgruppen. We had a roster, send it to all the POW camps. If you've got anybody in this officer rank, I didn't want any enlisted men in my dock. Officers only. Higher ranks. I had 6 or 9 generals, I don't remember. And I picked them on the basis of their education. Many of them with PhDs, one of them with 2 PhDs. It was Dr. Otto Ohlendorf. He killed 33,771 Jews, I think, in 2 days, 29-30 September 1941. First time I heard the doctor. Was another story about him, but anyway, I picked all the defendants, and I rested my case in 2 days. The defense took about 5 months with their lies and their alibis, for I knocked those all out. All of the defendants were convicted. 14 of them were sentenced to death. That was my first case in my life. I was 27 years old. The case has never been matched in human history. I hope never will be. So that's how I launched my legal career, okay?
If you're in a jurisdiction that requires a verification code, please write the following code word down. Speculative. S-P-E-C-U-L-A-T-I-V-E. Speculative.
It's very important for people to understand the mentality of mass murderers. It's very easy to say they are wild beasts, they are monsters. How could they do such inhumane things as they did? Well, certainly what they did was even more inhumane than the normal human mind would conceptualize. For example, many of the commanders allowed their soldiers to take the infants by the feet and smash their heads against a tree to save ammunition, kill them that way. My lead defendant was Dr. Otto Ohlendorf, O-H-L-E-N-D-O-R-F, Dr. Otto Ohlendorf, who had studied economics. He was a general in the SS, stormtroopers, in charge of Einsatzgruppe D, one of the units, father of 5 children, very well educated, as were all of my defendants, selected on the basis of their education, because I had a choice of 3,000 men, and I had only 27 seats, which had to be filled, no more, in the Nuremberg courthouse. Quite a ridiculous limitation, but nevertheless, it was a reality. And I said, pick them by the basis of their rank and education. The higher the rank, the more education they qualify. So, anyway, Mr. Ohlendorf explained that he never allowed his men to do that. He smashed the infants with their head against a tree. He said, he told his men, don't do that. When you see a mother holding an infant, of course the infant is crying and the mother is probably crying too, aim for the infant. And then you kill them both with one shot. So you save ammunition, you quiet the mother down. And he used that to show how humane he was. And I'm sure he was kind to his cats and dogs. But it never dawned upon him that this might be a horrible crime, because that's what they were doing. They were eliminating the Jewish race, the faith of the earth, to protect Germany and the rest of the world from abuse. Well, I got to know Ohlendorf's thinking quite well, and it has never escaped my memory, particularly since I find it being repeated by other countries and other people, and perhaps we will deal with that later on when we talk to the position of the United States. The United States at Nuremberg laid down certain principles of justice and of law. Justice Jackson was an outstanding lawyer and an outstanding human being. Some of the fundamentals which I learned from him, or was repeated by him, was that the law is not static, and it must be changed to meet the needs of the times. And he was dealing then with the idea of sovereignty. The king could do no wrong. Well, it used to be when they first invented the idea of sovereignty, but it didn't last very long. When they recognized that sovereignty belongs not to some distant monarch who has the right of the droit de seigneur, as they called it in French, of testing the virginity of the subjects before he gave permission for them to get married, things of that kind. So Jackson said law must apply equally to everyone. Aggression is the supreme international crime, because during a war of aggression, all other crimes are committed. I can testify to that of my own knowledge. When the Russians came into Berlin, they raped everything that walked, as far as I could make out. I got up there fast. I was looking for Hitler. And the German girls would plead with American soldiers to take them, protect them from the Russians. They went on a rampage of raping, which had to be stopped after it was allowed to run deliberately for a certain period of time. And the Russians, of course, walked into a hail of fire when they tried to take Berlin. And it took enormous courage, or being drunk or whatever, to walk into that kind of fire, because the Russians were really slain. And their desire for vengeance, taking it out on raping all the women and men and dogs, and I don't know what else they did, was pretty awful. Jackson, we didn't deal with rape in Nuremberg. Mrs. Steiner, who led the American women's movement in the United States, came to see me once, and she asked me, how come we didn't charge rape as a crime? I said the Russians had to agree, and they weren't going to agree, because rape was not a crime, it was a policy. So that's one of the attributes of war, and to say that war is the supreme international crime is certainly correct, because all the other crimes, and it leads me to the conclusion, well, we have to stop war making. We have to take away when you have no social controls. That's when the animal in males and females has no control. and they do all kinds of things which are highly objectionable. So anyway, we're back to Justice Jackson trying to lay down a rule of law saying it has to apply equally to everyone, including those who sit in judgment. These were principles that seemed to me to be so correct that they have served as guides to me in judging subsequent behavior by the United States and other governments. So let us move on. What does it take to create a world in which there are no wars? Let us begin by considering the situation as it is today. Today the system is, in all countries, you have an enemy state. You're unable to settle your disputes by peaceful means because you don't have any institutions to help you with that. And so you go to war against each other. You send your young people out to kill their young people. And they kill each other until they get tired of killing. Then they stop, and each side declares a victory. Then they rest for a while. Then they start again, and they continue killing each other. That is the current system. And in order to maintain that system, they engage in arms races to have more munitions and better munitions than the other guy. So they drain off all of their assets, which would be used or could be used to satisfy the discontents which drive each group to try to overcome the other and use it instead to kill more people. That is the current system. I think it's crazy. It's just plain crazy. It drains the societies of their young blood. It costs them the money they need for decent living. It achieves absolutely nothing because the temporary gains that they hear, they lose later someplace else. And that's what we're up against. We have glorified war for centuries. And how do you turn that around? This is a problem which occurred to me as I became a witness to the consequences of war. And I realized right at the outset that you cannot reverse what has been glorified for centuries in a short period of time. It will take much more time than that. And I was reminded of the story of Tycho Brahe, which I may have told in other contexts as well, the Danish astronomer who lived at the time of Kepler and Copernicus and other astronomers who studied the stars in order to find the meaning of the universe. And Tycho Brahe, who was a Swedish nobleman, he persuaded the king to let him build an astronomical observatory on the island of Ven, which is not far from Elsinore in Sweden. And there he went, and he had his own telescopes, and he studied the stars. And he kept a chart, a book of charts of the stars. And he did that for about 25 years, and the old king died. And the new king came on the throne, and he said to his fiscal people, what's going on there at Ven? What's going on? It costs us so much money to maintain that. So they sent people down, and they woke him up, Tycho, because, as you know, astronomers have to work at night, and they sleep by day. So they woke him up and said, old man, what have you been doing these last 25 years? He said, I've been charting the stars. You've been what? I've been charting the stars. Well, what do you mean by that? Well, I have books which indicates that I've measured them all myself. I swear by everyone is absolutely correct. And I already have 97 such charts. Well, what do you hope to achieve with it? Well, if I live long enough, I hope to have 100. But what's the use of it? What good is it? Well, he said, you know, I must admit, I have not yet been able to determine the meaning of the universe. But I know that someday somebody will, and I will have saved that person 25 years of labor. And the sequel to the story is a couple of hundred years later. The Americans planted their flag on the moon, and I'm told that they had with them the tables of Tycho. So that has been an inspirational story, which has guided me as well. I'm aware that we cannot change the mindset glorifying war making to suddenly change, but it can be changed, and it is being changed. And so let me give you an outline of what I think is missing in the current setup and how it affects us in our daily lives. And I've written 2 volumes on defining international law, 2 volumes on an international criminal court, 2 volumes on enforcing international law, many other volumes on global restructuring of the universe, all of which were read by my wife. I'm not sure they were read by anybody else, but they were well reviewed, and Kofi Annan was kindly enough in my last big book, New Legal Foundations for Global Survival, to say it was a very important work and everything the United Nations stands for. So I've thought these things through very carefully in scholarly way too, and I've come to the conclusion that there are 3 fundamental things you need for a peaceful society. And a society means a city, a town, a state, a nation, a world. And that is, first, you have to have clear laws to define what's permissible and what's not permissible. Then you need courts, which will determine whether the laws have been violated or not. And they must be independent and must understand the laws and must be objective. And then you need a system of effective enforcement, because without enforcement you've got nothing. Now, we have come a long way in laws. We haven't outlawed war making. We call it terrorism sometimes, but we have come a long way in not making it sound quite as glorious as it used to be. Not every army is glorified and so on, but still we're still stuck in that original concept. We haven't come far enough in clarifying our laws. The obvious one is defining aggression. I'll spend a little time on that, tell you where that stands. And in courts, look what we have got. We've got an international criminal court in The Hague, and it only took them 70 years or so to be created. And what tickled me no end is when the new International Criminal Court was erected in The Hague, they had their first case against Lubanga, a guy in Africa who was seizing young kids and making child soldiers out of them, and that's a war crime. The chief prosecutor of that case, Moreno Ocampo of Argentina, called me up, sent me a note, Ben, we want you to do the closing remarks for that case. And I went to The Hague, and I did the closing statement for the prosecution. And I was then 92 years old. So between the first time when I was 27, when I called upon nations, to behave in a more humane way, it was my appeal of humanity to law. I remember the opening statement. It is with, I may see if I recall, it was not, the film was not picked up on the tape until after the judges said, we'll now hear from the prosecution. Before the cameras could shift, the first sentence had gotten out. It is with sorrow and with hope that we here disclose the massacre of, millions of innocent people and so on. But the 2 points was sorrow and hope. And that was the theme which not only I used to guide me in that particular trial, but in everything I have done in seeking that goal. Sorrow that we have these conditions, hope that we can change it. And I have not changed those sentiments at all. And I'm amazed at how much progress we have made in fulfilling the hope aspect of it. Because when I first said we've got to make the International Criminal Court a permanent institution, not just what comes in and goes out, I was advised by respected friends, experts. They said, Ben, it'll never happen. You're on a fool's errand. And I said, you may be right, but I'm going to try anyway, because it's wrong not to have it. And so I, in fact, dedicated the remainder of my life to fighting for an international criminal court. And when they finally get their first case, and they say, Ben, you come up here and you do the closing, you've earned it. That was I was very pleased with that. I've been given many medals, most of which I pay no attention to because they're usually promoting some other event. Some of them I don't fit that category. Many of them don't. But another one I particularly enjoy, two more I particularly enjoy, I would say. One was the Harvard Law School giving me their highest award, the Medal of Freedom. And I respected that because the person who got it before me was Nelson Mandela. And he had spent 20 years in solitary confinement before he earned that. So I was very pleased with that. And then there was another funny thing right here. There's a street, Benjamin Ferencz Path, outside the International Court of Justice. And they've named the street after me, which tickles me somehow. It's not a boulevard, and it's not a main thoroughfare, but it's the Firenze Path, and it's facing on the Court of Justice in The Hague, not the criminal court, but the permanent court, which has been there for many years, built by Andrew Carnegie. So there are things like that which tell me that we are making progress. But on the enforcement arm, which is vital, without enforcement, law is farce. And we haven't even begun to build the mechanisms that we need to enforce the laws which we say should apply, and the standards and the ethics and the morality which we say should apply, which all appears in the United Nations Charter, accepted theoretically by all nations, ignored by many, particularly the powerful nations. So that is the scene, as I see it, in the world community.